Today, should asylum applications be fast-tracked? Is there enough debate about the war in Ukraine? And when will the 4 new hospitals be delivered? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP and former Chief Whip Wendy Morton, Liberal Democrat Foreign Affairs spokesperson Layla Moran, journalist and author Paul Mason and executive editor of the website Unheard Freddie Sayers. On the programme.
That's what I'm here to set out today, how a new mission-driven Labour government will end sticking plaster politics.
The Labour leader looks to the future, but is there enough substance in his 5 missions?
Morning, Mr. President.
Everyone wants to be pictured in Kyiv, but is there too little debate about the war in Ukraine?
Overflowing sewage, and over here is a rat that's just come out of the sewage.
Damaged drains, leaking roofs, ceilings supported by props. Why are so many hospitals in a state of disrepair?
Does the Prime Minister understand, though, how upset my constituents are to have bookings for weddings and other special family events cancelled when the Home Office took over a much-loved hotel?
Is fast-tracking applications the answer to clearing the backlog of asylum seekers living in hotels? Well, let's start with that story you heard there at the end of the headlines. This is how the Daily Mail is reporting it. They're calling it an amnesty row over fast-track for asylum seekers. It was raised, as you saw there in Prime Minister's questions yesterday, about the issue of asylum seekers being kept in hotels across the UK. This idea is to fast-track asylum applications from asylum seekers from a number of countries, including Afghanistan and Syria, to try and clear the backlog. Talking about 12,000 or so. They would get a questionnaire and not an interview. Is it a good idea?
Look, we know that there's a backlog of asylum cases.
Yeah, it's huge.
Absolutely, we need to tackle. We also know that communities are not happy when they find that there's a local, much-loved hotel that is full of asylum seekers, so something has to be done. So there is this new scheme. I think it's important that, certainly I'm looking for the detail of what it actually means. I think it's important, though, to recognise it isn't assuming that there's one outcome or another if for those 12,000 that are to be processed, and it's important to look at it in the round alongside the other work that we're doing in terms of asylum, and making sure, for me, this is a success if it is all part of that, saying to people very clearly, if you come to the UK illegally, then expect to be detained and then returned.
Fast-tracking, is it a good idea to get through some of the 90,000 claims that were submitted to the UK before last June?
Yeah, I've been calling for them to put more people on processing asylum claims for some time. There's a detention centre in Oxford, Western Abingdon and Kidlington that they're planning to reopen because they have so many now in the system that actually, having closed it just a few years later, they're going to spend hundreds of millions of pounds creating spaces for up to just 400 of them. I mean, this money should be better spent on processing. And I think, yeah, let's give this a go. I think one of the things that doesn't make any sense to me, though, is if you're going to send out a questionnaire, it's only in English. I mean, that just strikes me as bizarre. We know that many of these people, and I've supported them as their constituency MP, are traumatised. Many don't speak English at first. If you're going to have a fair system where they can make the case and you can assess it properly, let's put the resources properly behind it, which should include interpreters.
Is it sending the right message in terms of the deterrent that Wendy Morton and government claim they want to put in place? Freddie, if you are going to fast-track, or the Mail is calling it an amnesty?
No, it's not. I mean, quite clearly, the message is it's easier. If you don't have to go through the interview process, all you need to do now is fill in a form. That's 12,000 more people who come in easier. These are 5 countries, including Eritrea, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya and Yemen. They have a combined population of over 100 million people. And if the message going back to those places is Britain is such an easy push now that you don't even need to have an interview, that is going to have exactly the opposite effect.
I disagree, and that's why the point is that I was making was, yes, it's about a process. It's about making sure we have the detail of that process, but it's clearly linked in with our other mechanisms that we have around illegal migration, be that the boats policy and the Rwanda policy, and absolutely making sure that this isn't predetermining at all the outcome of these 12,000 claims.
Although I think around 95% of applications from people from the countries that Freddie Sayers has just outlined are accepted.
Well, I think let's just absolutely wait and see, because to me that is the critical thing here.
Which is why the number 12,000 has been put out there as possibly the number of fast-tracked asylum applications that could be accepted.
There's 120,000, the highest ever, people waiting, human beings who've gone through hardship and stress and unpleasantness in their lives, waiting for the decision by our government as to whether or not they get into the asylum process. It's not their fault that no one has decided this. It isn't their fault that they came here amid the stress and disaster, frankly, that's going on in North Africa and some of the countries we talked about, Afghanistan. It's very hard to see anyone being sent back to Afghanistan having an asylum claim refused. And so it is good that something's being done. We should first of all ask ourselves how we got to this situation. But let's say, OK, you do this. It's not about sending messages. The asylum system is not designed to send messages. It's designed to fulfil a universal human right. And the number one message I want to send is that Britain respects the universality of the right to claim asylum.
But
hang on, let me let Freddie come back in first, and then I'll get a final word.
There's a kind of unspoken fact here, which is we've just done some polling at Unheard about immigration, and still now, all of these years after Brexit, with apparently it coming down as a priority for voters, we calculate that every single constituency in Great Britain, other than Bristol West, as it happens, is net against immigration being as high as it is. And that includes parties, including the Liberal Democrats, including the Tories, and including Labour. I know Paul is keen on becoming a Labour MP, so we need to pay attention to what voters actually want and deliver what they're asking for.
I mean, there is a difference between seeking asylum, of course, and migration in general. But Wendy?
Absolutely. And that point about constituencies, I know what my constituents will write in about, and this is one of their top concerns. It's in my inbox a lot of the time. But I think it's important that we distinguish between legal routes and illegal routes, and quite often when we're having this debate, the two get muddled together.
Wendy, I'm sorry, you closed the legal routes. That's why this is happening. Surely the answer is partly to reopen the legal routes too, so that they can fill in these forms not when they've got to the country, but before they even
would you
leave.
like legal routes from Yemen, from Saudi Arabia, from Eritrea?
There needs to be. I mean, we've closed the one from Syria, for example, and in the time it was open, we resettled 4,500 with proper support. Last year it was something like 450. The legal routes are absolutely key, and it stops them from having to get in the boats in the first place.
Well, you mentioned Paul obviously wanting to be a Labour candidate. Let's talk about the Labour Party, because Keir Starmer, the leader, has delivered a major speech, one of a series of speeches he's going to be making around Labour's 5 key missions. He was in Manchester setting out the broad parameters of Labour's election manifesto. We can see them here. Deliver the highest growth in the G7, become a clean energy superpower, securing the NHS for the future, make our streets safe and break down barriers to opportunity. I would say there's nothing to probably disagree with in those 5 broad missions. Let's listen to Keir Starmer answering questions from journalists about the fact that perhaps he wasn't addressing the issues of the here and now.
We've had 13 years of sticking plaster politics. We've had 13 years of going round and round in circles, always ending up in the same place and never moving forward. And this is absolutely needed. And I reject the argument that the public don't get it. Everybody knows in their own life that you do fix a problem when it comes from maybe your pipes or your car or whatever it is. But everybody knows you've also got to fix the fundamentals. Otherwise, you'd just be back in the same place at the end of the exercise.
Let's talk to the Shadow Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, who is there in Manchester. Hello to you, Bridget. One of the first things that struck people, I think, is the vagueness of these missions. Not having the answers for the here and now is a problem, isn't it? Double-digit inflation, backlogs in the NHS and labour shortages. People want to know what you would do with that now.
We've got plenty to say about the here and now, but the problem that we face right now as a country is not a shortage of short-term fixes. It's that we've got a sticking plaster politics that isn't addressing those longer-term challenges that we need to deal with as a country. And that's why what Keir Starmer has set out today around Labour's plan for those 5 national missions is about how we do deliver a better Britain for everyone in our country. Because I'm confident that, our best days do lie ahead of us. I'm really hopeful and optimistic about the change that a Labour government could deliver. And I think that's what the British people want to see. They want a government that's focused on the long term, has their interests at heart, and not just a government in the form of Rishi Sunak, where all of those commitments he's made are problems that his government are responsible, at least in many of those cases, are responsible for causing anyway. That is not the answer our country needs now.
All right, well, let's have a look at some of the areas. I mean, the number one priority is the economy, and you've said you want to deliver the highest growth in the G7. Just one concrete way you're going to do that.
So take, for example, education, the area that I'm responsible for. Childcare is a really big barrier to lots of people taking part in work, so particularly women who give up jobs they love and cut back on their hours because childcare is so expensive. That reform of childcare that we'll deliver, the first step being breakfast clubs, so to make it easier for parents to combine dropping off their children at school and getting to work, but a bigger reform too, because what Keir was also saying is that it's not enough just to continue to prop up systems that just aren't delivering for the British people. So we do need to see longer-term change that I think reflects the lives that people live today.
And I know that childcare is going to be a big issue for you and probably all of the parties at the next general election. But that policy that you've just outlined, what percentage would that add in terms of GDP? How much will the economy grow as a result of your policy on childcare?
When you take that policy around childcare together with our apprenticeship reform, together with the plan that John Ashworth, my colleague, the Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary, has set out around getting many of those inactive over 50s back into work, that would make a significant contribution, not just to growing our economy, but also to making sure that we see people better off, more money in their pockets, better off, people feeling that government is making a difference in their lives. It's all of that taken together. It's fixing our Brexit deal, it's having an industrial strategy, it's Britain being proud of our place in the world once more, looking outward, trading, harnessing those opportunities where it comes to making us a clean energy superpower.
Well, you've mentioned the Brexit.
We've set out a lot about those changes we could make in the short term as well as that longer term plan.
But what everyone is wanting to know from Labour is how you're going to achieve these laudable aims that you have set out in terms of growth. If we're going to stick with the economy, you mentioned improving the Brexit deal. Well, there are some concrete suggestions, helpfully, I'm sure, from the Labour's London Mayor, Sadiq Khan, who says Labour should be having a debate about rejoining the single market. That would add and grow the economy and add to our GDP. Do you agree with him?
I agree that we need to fix the Brexit deal that evidently isn't working, and I do think we need a closer trading relationship with the European Union.
And is that by rejoining the single market?
Where I would disagree is that I don't think people want to reopen these bigger, more fundamental questions. We spent a very long time as a country going through a period of real division. I think there are immediate steps that we should be taking right now to fix that deal and to make our country more competitive, and that will be the focus of a Labour government under Keir Starmer.
Layla, you are in favour, no doubt, of rejoining the single market. The OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, it's not just Sadiq Khan, has restated its forecast that actually the UK economy will be 4% smaller than it would have been if we'd remained in the EU. Can you persuade Bridget Phillipson to at least look at and debate this idea of rejoining the single market, as Sadiq Khan has suggested?
It's not for me to persuade the Labour Party to do anything.
Too, don't you?
But what we've said is, we have a 4-step plan of which the end point is getting into the single market, because that's what businesses are telling us, that kind of certainty. But actually first, and I think this is where us and Labour will agree, there are actually other things that we need to focus on that are more achievable in the shorter term. So rejoining Erasmus, rejoining Horizon Europe for our science sector, and also, and this is really critical, a veterinary agreement, which would actually go some way to help
Labour are in favour of that too. I mean, another
but to take it off the table, I think, is a mistake. That's where we and Labour definitely disagree.
Well, I mean, there is another suggestion coming at perhaps from a different angle, Bridget Phillipson. In the Daily Telegraph, you'll have seen Jeremy Hunt's tax raid is drastically anti-investment, warns BT. Telecoms company joins joins growing opposition to proposed increase in corporation tax. This is the proposal that will go from 19% to 25% in April. Labour is not moving away from that. Why don't you just keep it at 19%? Propose that as a way of attracting investment and getting business on side.
Well, of course, I'll listen to business leaders and their views about how we grow our economy. And I speak to lots of business leaders right across our country, including business leaders running some of our biggest firms. I was doing that just last night, talking about how we make sure the next generation of young people have got skills,
corporation tax
and
at
how we
19%.
invest in our workforce. I've got to say, that doesn't really come up as an issue.
Well,
that's not
BT's
number one
just
issue
said
that
it
business
here.
is telling me that they're concerned about right now. Absolutely, and the chief executive is right to raise his concerns if that's his view. But I've got to say that's not the view that I hear around the country when I'm speaking to businesses, particularly some of those bigger businesses. Their priority is around how we make sure we get more skills within our economy, and also how we get some stability from government, because all of the uncertainty that we've seen in recent months with the Conservatives, with the crash of the economy, with the recklessness and the cavalier manner that they've dealt with all of this, it's created real instability, and it's made Britain a less attractive place to invest. And what I hear from business is that they want a serious government focused on that, and they want us to make that transition around net zero and create brilliant jobs. And one of the missions that we've set out today is around how we do harness that opportunity and that potential that we have as a country, and create those jobs and opportunities.
I still haven't heard
country.
that many specifics, or any really specifics from you, apart from your childcare policy. Wendy Morton, on the corporation tax, who do you agree with? Do you agree with Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt, or is BT right?
Well, look, I've got businesses in my patch who are saying, please don't increase corporation tax. I mean, I hope that the government continues to look at it, but I think this comes back to growing our economy, and it also comes back to, we've been listening to Labour's 5 missions. This is the 11th relaunch we've had of the Labour Party.
We've got Rishi Sunak's 5 priorities, or 5 pledges. He's doing
clearly,
they've only had one leader.
But five is obviously the magic number here. But what I'm about to say, Joe, is that Labour's setting out missions. People, I think, and businesses want more than a mission. They want to know what Labour is going to do today. We've set out, yes, our 5 priorities, but very, very clearly what we're going to do. And reducing inflation is a really key part of that, which will help business, which will grow the economy.
But the
help
government and Labour agree on
pockets.
corporation tax. So what's to pick between you from a business, from BT's perspective?
Well, I think that's up to BT, isn't it? But I mean, they will look at the whole package, not just corporation tax.
Well, let's have a look at the whole package, as you put it. There is an issue of trust. I will come to both of you in a moment. There is an issue of trust in terms of what Keir Starmer is promising, Bridget Phillipson, because he had 10 pledges, I think, that he stood on in his leadership campaign, and a number of them have fallen by the wayside. One that is certainly not firm anymore is in your area of education, and that's tuition fees. Keir Starmer pledged to abolish tuition fees. You're not going to do it, are you?
I think what we've seen today from Keir Starmer, and what you always get with Keir Starmer, is someone that has deep-seated Labour values and will always do what's right by the country. Where it comes to the higher education funding system that we have right now, I'm clear that it is not sustainable.
Right.
It's become even more aggressive in that time.
So will you abolish them?
Since we had the Labour leadership, we need a different system. It needs replacing with a different system altogether. It's not sustainable, it's not right for the taxpayer, and it isn't giving universities the certainty that they need. So we need a more progressive system. Absolutely, that has to be the case. But, you look at the shape of the economy, and you look at the impact and the damage that the Tories have caused with that mini budget, with Liz Truss, with everything that's followed since. And we're going to face some pretty tough decisions if we're fortunate enough to win that election and form the next government.
Okay.
And that comes down to the decisions that were taken in the short term, but also over the last 13 years. So when Wendy criticises what we're setting out, that longer-term vision and that longer-term plan, I tell you, there's one way that we could see what the British people think, and that's by having a general election. Let's see who the British people prefer. Let's see whether who they think has the better vision for a Britain that is more focused in the long run, that isn't just dealing with the problems that the government have themselves created. NHS waiting lists, crime rising, all of these problems. They've had 13 years.
All right, well, let Wendy come back.
to set out a mission, you know, people want the detail. People also want to know how is this going to be funded as well, and that's the issue that I have. And this is the, as I said, the 11th relaunch of the Labour leadership. So when you're talking about trust, where do you go from there?
All right, Paul and Freddie. Paul, first of all, we heard from Bridget there saying that Keir Starmer, you can trust him on his Labour values. But when you look at those leadership pledges, I took a look at them again. Ending outsourcing in the NHS. It's not going to end outsourcing in the NHS. That may be the right decision. He also said there'd be public ownership of rail, mail, water. It's now only rail. The whole direction of Keir Starmer's leadership has changed, and probably for electoral reasons. But how can people trust what he stands for?
I think the reason you can trust Keir, and I sat in a room with Keir Starmer at the point at which he was going to make those pledges, is that what drives him now is the same thing that what drove him then, the desire for social, climate and economic justice. And I, as someone who's on the left of the party, am more than happy to take the explanation that he gives, that things changed, big things changed, and what is more... wait a minute. No, what has changed is we're in a war, a war of global significance, and we had the biggest pandemic of our lifetimes. And
so he's moved closer to the Conservatives?
Well, I don't think these... Safe streets, clean energy, zero carbon...
That's motherhood and apple pie,
these are things... These are things that the Conservatives have not delivered, will not deliver, certainly on the healthcare.
So you'll do the same things but better?
No. The philosophy behind these pledges is that the state must drive the market, because the market is not delivering any of them.
The amazing transformation of Keir Starmer from a Corbyn lieutenant to the person he is today, which is, you could describe it as Blairite, you might be more accurate if you call it Remain a Tory, has been astonishing. And actually, Paul Mason, who's sitting next to me, has gone through a similar journey over the past few years from a Corbyn lieutenant to someone who now hopes to be a Keir Starmer MP. What we're seeing is not just triangulation. It means we are returning to the first election in a long time, I'd say since 2015, in which the two leaders of the main parties are so close. They are varying shades now of managerial technocrat, and that may be a very good strategy for Keir Starmer. He might well do very well, but there will be a lot of voters who thought they were voting for something new, and they will be very disappointed.
All right, well, just briefly, Bridget, before we let you go on the NHS, we're going to talk about the hospitals pledge that was made by Boris Johnson. Would Labour commit to the money that is needed to build, rebuild, improve these 40 hospitals?
Our NHS is at crisis point. We can all see that. What we will not do, however,
but I didn't
is what
ask
Boris
you that.
Johnson
I just want you to
make...
No, you won't make the pledge, so you won't say that you're...
No, it's an important point. He never had a plan to deliver it.
Yeah, but I'm asking about your plan.
What we won't do is make promises that we aren't confident. We will make promises that we will deliver. That is absolutely vital to trust in politics. Boris Johnson had no intention of ever building 40 hospitals. There were never going to be 40 hospitals. What we would do, where it comes to the NHS, is make sure that we're investing in the workforce of the future. So we've got a plan to double medical school training places, to deliver more health visitors, more nurses, more staff into our NHS. That's vital. It's a fully funded, fully costed plan that would deal with that challenge that we see, would make sure that we're addressing that waiting list problem. We won't be making commitments we're not confident we can deliver. That's the difference in the approach that we're taking and the Conservatives.
Bridget Phillipson, thank you very much for joining us, Shadow Education Secretary there in Manchester. We'll stick with the hospitals discussion and that pledge that was made by Boris Johnson in 2019. Let's just have a look at a video that was recorded outside King's Lynn Hospital in Norfolk.
Overflowing sewage, and over here is a rat that's just come out of the sewage.
Let's talk to Rebecca Fisher. She's from Norfolk. She filmed that a few weeks ago. Hello to you, Rebecca, and your daughter there. What's her name?
Cleo.
Hello, Cleo. Why do you use the hospital as often as you do?
So Cleo has a condition that affects her blood sugars. So we're in and out of the hospital quite frequently for brain scans, blood tests, and just being admitted in general if she's poorly.
And what's it like? We saw a little bit of footage there for the video you filmed, pretty shocking.
Yeah.
What is it like? What are the problems there?
The sewage, the video was the first time we'd noticed the sewage before. We'd gone through a different entrance than we usually use. But most of the time when we visit the hospital, it's pretty much a building site. There's over 3,000 props currently holding the hospital's roof up. And some of them are even in the children's wards. So when we are admitted and we have to stay overnight, there are wooden props above our head to keep the roof up, and that can be quite scary.
Do you think there's any chance that that hospital, the hospital you use, will be rebuilt or improved?
I'm hoping so. There's been campaigns for quite a number of years now to get a new hospital, because the one that we've currently got is just inadequate. But so far we haven't seen any new plans. I know they're planning on building a multi-storey, because there's quite a few problems with the car park as well. The car park just isn't big enough for the amount of people that use the hospital. But there's no plans currently, in place 100% for a brand new hospital, and it needs to be done. All
right, Rebecca, stay with us. Wendy, listening to that, I mean, can you give her any reassurance?
Look, I'm not the health secretary, so I don't have the plan. But what I will say though is that we did make that pledge. A lot has happened since then. Don't forget, we have had COVID, we have had the pandemic. I think it's also important to all recognise that there is investment going into the NHS. And listening to Bridget Phillipson earlier, I wasn't sure that there even was a plan there. But there is money that is going into the training of doctors and nurses. There is also the surgical hubs that we're investing heavily in, the community diagnostics. And when it comes to actual hospitals, I know in my own area in Walsall, we're almost seeing the completion of the new accident and emergency department at Walsall Manor, which was a £40 million investment. So there is investment going into our hospitals, but I appreciate that the lady being interviewed clearly isn't seeing it where she is.
Right, are you reassured by that, Rebecca?
Not really. I think it's scary enough to have a poorly child that's in and out of hospital anyway. And then you go into an NHS hospital and you're seeing sewage and props, and even just to have a plan in place would give us reassurance. But at the moment, we're visiting the hospital and all we're seeing is, a building site.
But I think when it comes, if the issue is, things like raw sewage, absolutely, whoever is responsible needs to tackle things like that, because that is not right.
Are you saying your government's not responsible?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying there is a big issue about the big pieces of investment, but then there are some maintenance issues clearly here as well.
Yeah, and the hospital apparently said they did clear it up pretty quickly. The problem is, though, Wendy, I mean, we can see it here. There's Boris Johnson. We will build and fund 40 new hospitals by 2030. He repeated that pledge on a number of occasions. And when you look at the progress, after 3 years, most of them haven't even got planning permission.
And so we need to keep pushing forward with that. But what I'm saying is that we have had a pandemic in the middle of this, which has impacted on our health service. But to say that we're not investing in the NHS is just simply not true.
So that's the same excuse. Sorry, Lenny.
Well, just the scale of the undelivery, I think, is worth mentioning. So of the 40 Liberal Democrat Freedom of Information requests revealed that only 10 have even put in for planning permission. So the idea that you're going to get to this 40 number before 2030 is ludicrous. I think the government needs to now come clean and say that they're not going to deliver it. You look at crumbling buildings. We've got one in St Helier in Sutton that my former colleague Tom Brake fought really hard for. They've been promised a new hospital. That hasn't had anything done to it at all. So it's going to be a broken promise.
The bigger picture about these broken promises is here you've got the Labour side and the Conservative side both making exactly the same excuse for why their pledges have been broken. It's because of Ukraine, it's because of the economic crisis, it's because of COVID. So if both the main parties are giving the same excuse for why they're not following their pledges, of course voters will become cynical. You can understand that. And what I worry about is that with this sort of merging of the two main parties, we're going to see new populist movements, we're going to see new kinds of political movements that people around this table will find quite unsavoury because people are running out of hope in the main parties.
I mean, 5 apparently are under construction of the 40. 2 are complete. And as we've discussed, planning permission hasn't even been put in for a number of them. Should Labour say, we will commit to building those? Because we're not talking about day-to-day spending, we're talking about infrastructure. Why not, from the Labour Party's perspective, say this will help grow the economy, we'll commit, we'll put the money in?
What we're dealing with here is cleaning up a way of doing politics that I think we will look back on and see was a really bad idea. coming up, pledges like the one Johnson gave, 40 new hospitals. The other one, the laughable one, 1 new nuclear power station a year. Do you remember that? The other one, Liz Truss, GDP, 3% of GDP on defence by 2030. All of it, talk about populism, every single one of these was a populist lie. Because in reality, politics and doing things like building hospitals is difficult. I want Labour, Lib Dems, every front bench to be honest about the scale of disaster, to be honest, of a low-growth, stagnant economy, low-skill economy that we're left with, and cleaning it up isn't going to be done by building 40 new hospitals. We have a healthcare system that's struggling, teetering constantly every morning on the brink of crisis and collapse. That building 40 new hospitals is not the urgent thing. The urgent thing is sorting the social care system so when you get better from whatever disease you have somewhere to go. I will take that in exchange for 40 hospitals.
Well, no one's saying that the challenges aren't there, Paul, but a lot of this comes back to actually fixing the economy as well, which means, bringing down inflation, growing the economy. No, you can't keep going back to that.
That was really quite recently.
We need. I don't see any plan from the Lib Dems in terms of where you're going to grow.
And I'm confident we wouldn't have done that.
Grow the economy, get inflation down, get our debt down so that we can invest in our public services. But when I often hear the word thrown at political parties, but of all sides, about lies, 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 how on earth, when we speak that language, are we going to really try and bring people along the journey?
Rebecca might say by delivering on some of these pledges.
And we are delivering a lot of
I don't mean just the Conservatives. Rebecca, do you agree
pledges
with Paul Mason, who is on the panel, that this isn't the most urgent thing? Building and funding 40 new hospitals. How urgent do you think it is?
I think for King's Lynn it is very urgent. I mean, I don't know how you can really deliver quality care to someone when you're giving them the care, the ward they're in is being held up by wooden props, or like we have experienced being in the children's ward, we have got workmen walking through the ward, trying to do the work to the hospital to keep the roof up. I just think those things go hand in hand. And take King's Lynn, for example, a new hospital is needed more than anything else.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and to Cleo too for joining us. Just on that issue about urgency, but also about funding. I mean, the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives were criticised by Labour during the coalition years for cancelling so many of the infrastructure projects because they were seen to have perhaps stifled demand. Would it not be more radical for Labour to say, we won't do a private finance initiative, because that didn't work particularly well under Blair and Brown. We'll put it on the government balance sheet?
Well, Labour's single pledge on big spending is the 28 billion a year that Rachel Reeves pledged over green transformation, which includes everything from housing to energy, etc. I think she's been clear that some of that will be borrowed. They're also clear that the effect of it will be to grow the economy. This is something that the Treasury and the Conservative extremists don't accept, that investing actually grows the economy. So I think I want to see Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, come forward with proposals that indeed meet what that lady in King's Lynn is worried about. We do need, it's not just new hospitals, the infrastructure of the health service needs investment, but the investment has to come from somewhere, the money has to come from somewhere. So this is why Starmer is saying, you grow the economy in order to pay for a better NHS, in order to pay for more police on the streets. The growth aspect is critical, and the Conservatives have 12, 13 years to do it. You haven't done it. Move over and let a coalition of parties do it who can actually deliver it, I would say.
It's got to be said also that the COVID experience has changed the centre ground on all of this. The government suddenly found 300 billion plus to spend on COVID policies. There were 10,000 hospital beds that were built in 3 weeks at one point, so it shows if you really want to, it is possible, and it makes it very hard when failures like this happen.
It's hard for people to understand, eye-watering waste in PPE procurement, and yet they can't fix the sewage in a hospital. It really has.
Well, let's talk about where there is some political consensus over Ukraine, because the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began a year ago. The House of Commons remains unified on UK support for Ukraine. Let's just take a listen to part of yesterday's Prime Minister's questions.
This coming Friday, there will be a national moment of reflection, which will give us the opportunity to pay tribute to the courage of the Ukrainian people and demonstrate our solidarity with Ukraine.
Can I join the Prime Minister in his comments about Ukraine? I had the privilege last week of seeing firsthand the courage and resilience of the Ukrainian people, and we must continue to stand united in this House in support of Ukraine.
It was a pleasure to meet the delegation from Kyiv before questions and to confirm that across this House we are united in our support for Ukraine and its brave heroes.
Is that unity a good thing on the war in Ukraine, Freddie?
I think that unity is understandable given the incredible amount of suffering going on in Ukraine. But no, I don't think it is a good thing. I think it is dangerous when all the parties agree and that there is no discussion. And it almost feels like discussion is not allowed on this topic. If anyone ventures any kind of hesitation about the Western plans in Ukraine, they're very quickly dismissed as a Putin apologist or an appeaser. That kind of rhetoric comes out. Whilst good people who are very compassionate about the outrageous invasion happening in Ukraine can legitimately ask, what is the end game? What is the long-term strategy of the Western powers? Are there escalation risks? We hear all about new tanks, new aircraft. How much would be too much? Those are fair questions, I think. And I would like to hear more people talking about how this ends and less of a certainty about how we can up the ante all the time.
Paul?
How it ends is that Putin pulls out of Ukraine. It's just really simple. And we, as a, we're not just any old country. We're a member of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. We helped found the UN. We have a duty that arises from that to do what we've done, which is for politics to stay united in support of Ukraine. But I would argue, I don't think there is a consensus. I think actually beneath that consensus we had in the Commons, there's a lot of concern, not just along the lines that you've put, but for example within my own party, Labour. There's a wider feeling that if only this would go away and then things could go back to normal. And we know that because that's how people felt in the 1930s. If only Hitler and Mussolini would go away, we wouldn't have to rearm. I think Ben Wallace said it today in The Sun. There's going to be a conflict within a decade. And I think that very few people in British politics are prepared to change their modus operandi. You said I've changed. I've changed my modus operandi since being in Kiev to realise that this is the number one thing that's happening in my life, that it could destroy everything I've taken for granted, and that therefore politics has to respond to that.
Surely there are risks in both directions, right? There's got to be just purely doubling down, increasing the rhetoric. We had President Biden talking against President Putin yesterday or the day before. Who in the Western powers or in the wider world is trying to pour cold water on this situation? Who is trying to say, how can we bring the end closer? What might a diplomatic solution look like? Because ultimately, if there's fighting and bloodshed and people dying for 1 more year or 5 more years or 10 more years, a diplomatic solution ultimately is the only way to end it. We're not going to be marching on Moscow. They have 5,000 nuclear weapons pointing in this direction.
The problem we have, and to your point around, just very quickly about unity, just because we aren't actively disagreeing with each other does not mean, I'm Foreign Affairs spokesperson for my party, doesn't mean that we aren't thinking very deeply about these things, that there isn't actually discussion. And just because it's happening cross-party and it's trying to be very considered in the light of a man, Putin, who is like going through the looking glass in Alice in Wonderland, lives in a completely alternative universe to us, and actually wants a world order that is totally different to what we hold dear as democracies. I think I would just challenge you to say, don't assume that everyone's just thinking the same. We're not. We have constituents who write in very concerned about it, and it's not that we're taking it lightly. But the fact is, Putin himself is not in any mood to compromise, and I think he is very dangerous. I would agree with what Paul says. We are living through something that we are going to tell our grandchildren about. This is a complete change in not just this country, but the whole world. Geopolitics is back. This is really, really difficult stuff. And by all means, let's have a discussion, but let's not assume that it's not happening. It is happening. It's just happening in a way that's very considered, and perhaps
it's happening behind the scenes then. So it's happening behind the scenes.
No, it is happening, not necessarily behind the scenes. Well, here we are.
And I think, for me, what we're facing is a brutal, illegal invasion of Ukraine on the edge of the West. It impacts upon us all in many, many different ways, and I actually think it's really important that we do remain a position of solidarity as a country. There is space. I always believe in politics for discussion. It isn't always out there. It isn't always out on the front page of the newspapers. We have constituents that come to us. The vast majority of constituents that come to me are in support of what the UK is doing.
So what about fighter jets? What about fighter jets? To take up Freddie's point about is it rhetoric that's just mounting and escalating, should fighter jets be sent? That's certainly what Boris Johnson and his Truss have proposed.
I genuinely believe that nothing should be off the table. However, there is a time and a place, and you do things in the right way. And in terms of the UK, we've committed something like £230 billion. Or last year, we'll do the same. And I'm actually pleased that the Prime Minister has asked the Defence Secretary to actually go away and look at what more we can do. But it's not just about weapons, is it? No. It's also about looking at that piece longer term. It is about security. It's about many other factors.
I think the key thing it was interesting for all sorts of political reasons, the interventions for Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. But what they should know is that you also can't do that alone. The thing that Putin fears the most is not just the jets, but actually the unity of the West over this. You have to, if you are going to do this, then lead, but as a whole, you have to convince other Western democratic nations that they should be joining in too. And actually the effect this is having on cooperation, on repairing ties, on getting countries to talk to each other who maybe didn't about this for a long time, I think we will see a stronger, small L liberal international order that emerges from this, and that, I think, is a good thing.
The West, you talk about, the West is shrinking, I'm afraid to say, before our eyes, because you look at the majority of countries in the world, they haven't picked a side on this. The West now feels like Western and Central Europe and North America, and increasingly the new world order, in which America is no longer the global policeman that everyone will fall in behind, is really being revealed here. And that's what is sobering and frightening, that because they're considered a compromised actor in this, because of the missteps over Afghanistan and Iraq, there's no longer the sense that America could actually police a settlement. And we're now in the situation where people like China, these new rising powers, are almost going to be coming in as the new arbiters.
I mean, that is a fear, isn't it? I mean, we've already heard Anthony Blinken saying that there is a risk that China starts supplying weapons and ammunition to Russia.
An even bigger risk that very few people in the British establishment want to contemplate is that America walks away from NATO under a Republican president. So we have to plan for many eventualities. That's why we in the Labour Party are so strongly supportive of NATO. NATO is an insurance policy and always has been since its foundation under a Labour government to try and to persuade America not to walk away. Whether it can be the global hegemon, I don't think it can be. China has a role to play in world politics. Our job, what are all the tanks and fighter jets if we send them?
Is to spend more on defence, is to arm ourselves more?
I want rearmament, I want more defence, but more than that, our job is to demonstrate to Beijing that you do not get things by breaking international law. And I think we can do that. I think that is a doable task. And that's why, despite my criticisms of the Iraq war and the Afghan war, I've been...
What happened to the anti-war left? That is a fair question to Paul Mason. The Iraq war, there were a million people
sitting at this table supporting
Quite right.
Ukraine.
And Liberal Democrats were at the front of that too. Absolutely.
Just briefly before we go, we've talked a lot about the Northern Ireland Protocol, that post-Brexit trading arrangements for Northern Ireland. Wendy, for you, Chris Heaton-Harris, this tweet, let's show from Lisa O'Carroll. Chris Heaton-Harris, the Northern Ireland Secretary, to meet Maros Sefcovic in Brussels today from the EU as negotiations continue, but chance of deal this week faded, with Ukraine taking centre stage 1 year after Russia invasion. Do you think there's going to be a deal by Monday?
Look, I'm not a betting woman. We'll have to wait and see. And it is about making sure we keep a focus on Northern Ireland and the people. But I'm not going to bet on this. And it would be wrong actually for me to speculate when there's this, very, very sensitive negotiations that are ongoing.
But as a former chief whip, we know that negotiations are going on with wings of the Conservative Party, because we had a number of MPs who went in to see the Prime Minister. How difficult is it going to be to bring those wings on board?
Well, I am the former chief whip, so I'm going to leave it to the current chief whip. But it will have its challenges, but I will leave it to the chief whip.
Layla, are you expecting something? We were expecting something.
I think now that if there was white smoke this week, we were expecting it would come, latest today. I think that's very unlikely now.
Is it achievable, do you think?
Well, the biggest barrier to this now, and we understand from people in the know. The deal is done. The issue here is the Tory party, and it's divided, and its inability to be able to deliver this deal.
All right, that's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests for joining me today. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics UK at 12:15 and, of course, on Monday on BBC Two and the BBC iPlayer. Bye-bye.